Hi, folks. Happy New Year. It's been a while since I've done any live streaming, but bank holiday in the US. Why not do something a little bit different? So, I wanted to have a quick chat with anyone who tunes in or anyone catches up on this later about some stuff that I have published over the last couple of vlogs and podcasts about guardrails, cost reduction, tagging, trying to keep a handle on resources in cloud deployments, and quite what that looks like. And so I was having a chat with a couple of colleagues and a couple of ex-colleagues actually as well about this entire process um, after I released my last vlog. And so I just wanted to sort of address a few comments in there, specifically around what different cloud vendors offer up in terms of guardrails, compliance, monitoring, all that type of stuff. And this isn't supposed to be a deep dive. This is just some high level stuff to sort of keep people aware of what's out there and how the industry can help you. It's not there to prevent you doing stupid things. And also, sort of, your mileage will vary depending on what you're trying to do. Now, this isn't supposed to be a deep dive. I will get into some of this probably in a different vlog at some point in the coming months if people are interested. If people aren't interested, that is also cool. But I figured for posterity's sake, more than anything else, let's dig in. So hopefully everyone can see my browser, and I'm going to make this screen a bit bigger so that everyone can see it. We're going to start with Microsoft because that's currently where I spend most of my day. And we're going to look at the Cloud Adoption Framework. Now, the Cloud Adoption Framework is designed to help people who are new to Azure sort of get started doing cloud stuff in a reasonably sensible manner. The Cloud Adoption Framework is supposed to give you the guidelines and the understanding as to how to best design your sort of migration or deployment of cloud applications and services into Azure. So as you can see here, if we click through, there's an awful lot of information on this site, as with all Azure stuff. And you'll also know from a different Substack that I wrote that I'm not a huge fan of their documentation, but there is an awful lot of documentation here and ways for you to be able to get this stuff into a production-like environment. So I suggest that you start with like adoption journeys. Also, like the scenarios are certainly useful. If you come from an environment where you need to set up a specific type of setup, if you come from an Oracle background, how to deploy Azure. Now, we're going to get into these diagrams in a minute, but just for, example's sake, here is a, schematic of the way that they suggest that you set some of this stuff up. Now, you don't have to do all of it, but as you click through this, you'll find many things. The other thing that you'll find as well is they provide a lot of templates to get you going. So if you use infrastructure as code, which I suggest that you do, even if you're sort of new to this, because it helps you define the infrastructure in a way that means that you can understand what's deployed in your environment without a certain level of craziness and the governance that goes around it, then you can get this stuff kicked up and running in reasonably short order. That is the basics. That is not like kicks up and running, you're good to go, all your workloads are deployed. Because this could also be expensive. You've just seen that schematic that I popped up, and there's a lot of infrastructure there. Some of it doesn't cost a great deal of money, but some of it definitely does. And so you have to be cognizant of the reasons for you doing this. You know, they have a whole box here in the cloud adoption framework in strategy. And there's a number of different things which they cover off, like business outcomes. What do you want to do? Do you want to move your stuff from on-prem into Azure? Do you want to move your stuff from AWS into Azure? So on and so on. You know, the business, what does it gain from doing that? And so, you know, there's various business outcomes that you have to be able to like optimize for. That may be uptime, that may be accessibility, that may be geolocation. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But there is definitely a financial understanding that you need to like be able to like deal with, because as I pointed out in the last vlog, like Basecamp, for example, and DHH has moved a lot of his services that are stable back out to the cloud, because the cloud doesn't necessarily offer great bang for buck when it comes to like cost reduction for stable workloads, because you can buy some hardware and just like run it in a data center, and you, as long as your workload remains like, you know, at a certain threshold for that entire time, you don't have to like do anything special. The price will remain the same. Inside of the cloud, there's often like nuances that you have to factor in to deal with, like, you know, cost fluctuations. And there's certainly stuff that you can do to reduce that cost, but I don't think it's ever going to be as cheap as like sticking stuff in your own environment. Your own environment doesn't necessarily mean don't run it in a cloud. There is that nuance, so just bear that in mind. I did say we were going to have a quick look at landing zones. And so, like, you know, if you decide that Azure and the cloud adoption framework is the best way for you to go, then, you know, one of the things that you would potentially want to do if you're new to Azure is investigate the landing zones. And again, landing zones, they're not unique to Azure, but like this is often the starting point for a lot of stuff. But it doesn't have to be. Like, you can clearly start from a blank canvas, but there's a number of like ways that they would recommend that you do stuff in terms of segmenting out your cloud infrastructure that allows for sensible deployments, scalability, redundancy, you know, cross region connectivity, that type of thing. So we're going to look briefly at what we've got here. And so you end up with a number of different conceptual objects like deployed into Azure. And so you start with a management group, and that management group has a bunch of different objects in it that connect to different subscriptions. I was having a chat with someone at work the other day who's asking why we had so many different management groups, and it's pretty much for this reason. You can segment these things conceptually, logically, at management group level, and deal with authentication there, and that gives people a good level of access like into the different subscriptions. So you can see here in the middle of the screen we've got management group. I hope you can see. Can I make this any bigger? I don't think so. This is as big as it's going to go. But like, we've got management group in the middle of the screen. On that, we then attach to a number of subscriptions. So the management subscription, what's inside of a management subscription? So, you know, we've discussed what you might deploy when it comes to understanding sort of cloud deployments. And one of those things obviously is cost management, understanding what you're deploying into the cloud and how much your boss is going to pay for it is quite important. The other stuff that we have in there is like policy assignment, network analytics, you know, Microsoft Defender, that type of stuff that provides security, infrastructure, logging at management levels so that audit policies and all that type of stuff are adhered to and can provide a decent level of coverage over your deployment. The other thing it does do as well, as you can see in there, is also loop back into on-prem systems. So you don't have to lift and shift literally everything to the cloud. You can deploy some stuff and you can sort of migrate slowly. They've also got identity subscription, which once again, cost management, network watcher, defender for the cloud, all that type of stuff. That allows you to then understand how much you're spending when it comes to identity management. And again, can scale. Entra ID, if you go all in, you'll need different packs, you'll need different licenses, depending on what your use cases are, and also the redundancy required around that. Obviously, if you offload a bunch of stuff to Entra ID, it reduces the workload because you don't have as much that you have to deal with, but you do have to deal with the different license packs and the stuff that comes with it from a functionality perspective. So understanding how that works. You've then got connectivity. Connectivity, of course, can be external connectivity. It can also be internal connectivity. How do you expose users internally in your business to different services? How do you expose external users to external users to the services in your business? DNS resolution, connectivity between different VPNs and through firewalls, that type of stuff. And so understanding and laying out your connectivity is important. And then you get really into the landing zones, which again, depending on what you want to do, will look vastly different. And so, you've got a landing zone at the bottom down here labeled F, which has a lot of virtual machines, function apps, that type of stuff in it. Depending on what you deploy will depend an awful lot on, will dictate an awful lot of what this looks like. You've then got landing zone A2 subscription, which has different stuff in it, but again, virtual networks. And then inside of those virtual networks, well, not inside, but like alongside, you've then got the resource groups and the components that go with it. We do make a lot of use of Key Vault and storage. Function apps are obviously something that do get used quite a lot. So depending on what you want to spin up, those landing zones will look different, but they will all have a degree of networking. They will all have a degree of DNS resolution, access control, analytics, security, and so like by using infrastructure as code, you can obviously define what that looks like. But, if you're interested in learning about Azure landing zones and the way that you would sort of implement them, like I said, we can get into that in a more in-depth vlog, something that's not a live chat. But also, bear in mind that you'll see and hear an awful lot of people talk about landing zones, but they're not like a one and done thing. They will not get you going, but they are a good way to get going, if you know what I mean. So the other stuff that I want to look at quickly, and again, so it depends on what you're trying to do. So AWS, let me make this bigger again and hit the accept button. AWS have the well-architected framework, which is similar to the cloud adoption framework. And again, you have the various pillars that they determine to be good for like you getting your stuff going. One of the things we've just been harping on about is cost optimization. And so the cost optimization pillar will give you a bunch of documentation about how cost optimization should be driven inside of your AWS environment. If I go back up to the top, operational excellence, security, reliability, sustainability, and performance. But what you then get are these lenses, which are various papers and helper guides to get you going to understand how the well-architected framework might work well for you. So if you're doing machine learning, if you're doing governmental stuff, if you want to do SaaS software, if you're doing healthcare, we can have a look at the way that these work. And so from inside of that, you can then go through how to add the lens as a workload and then deploy that stuff into your cloud. different, there's a lot of useful information in here. I do quite like the AWS docs. But again, if you're going through something that's similar, there's an awful lot of learning that you can do inside of these documentation guides that will get you up and running and deploy stuff into clouds that, if you don't steer too far away from what they demonstrate, will give you an element of like best practice. Even if you don't know what you're doing from an experience perspective, you know that what you'll get stood up is not too far off the mark and will be, reasonably effective. As you get further into it, though, obviously you have to be aware of what you've got deployed, how much use you're making of the stuff you've got deployed, as we're talking about cost effectiveness and governance. And also, like, from a security standpoint, like, what impact the stuff that you're deploying has on your security. Does it blow a bunch of holes in what you're doing? Can you switch stuff off because you don't use it? All that type of stuff. And so, the AWS well-architected framework, if you're an AWS user, is a good place to start, and their docs are normally pretty decent. So there we go. The last thing I want to mention from an AWS perspective is if you're likely to turn it into a large AWS shop, something like AWS Control Tower is a good place to start if you bake it in early enough, because it gives you the governance across multiple AWS environments to allow you to understand what's going on across environments, make sure that compliant, make sure that you've got like top tier logging and analytics. Again, adds some complexity to it, but allows you to deal with, multiple environments in a single place. The way that the different cloud environments sort of segment their environments, you've got Azure that segments stuff with tenant level stuff, and then inside of that you've got subscriptions and resource groups. That's one way of doing it. AWS generally keeps their segmentation sort of more constrained to account level, and so you have multiple accounts, you switch between accounts to deploy different stuff. AWS gives you sort of an overarching view into what's going on across multiple accounts in a single business. So that sort of sums up what I wanted to look at just briefly. Like I said, it wasn't supposed to be a deep dive. I just wanted to raise a few points about the stuff that I've been talking about from a tagging perspective in the last vlog. There is as with all these things, there's about a million ways to do this, and depending on what your use case is and how you're planning to do it, your use case will differ, your implementation design will differ, and so will what you end up with as a finished product. No single cloud deployment looks exactly the same across everybody. That's just life. That's absolutely fine. But, if you start from a common core, at least your cloud process won't look too different. It will make sense to everybody, and you'll be able to bring in different contractors and different members of staff who will be able to slot in and understand what's going on without having to learn too much too soon. Hopefully that made sense. Hopefully this first quick live stream of the year is useful, people. I'm sure most of you will just see it in catch up. Hopefully you could see the screen, you can hear me. If you can't, I'll delete this and pretend it never happened. Other than that, happy Monday. I hope the rest of the week goes well, and I will see you all again soon.